All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Thursday, everybody. Hope all of you guys are having a great week. We are doing our final division preview today with the Southeast Division, probably the weakest division in the NBA, but still some interesting teams, interesting young players, and one team in particular that fits a lot of my personal basketball philosophies that I'm very, very excited about this year. So this is the Southeast Division. We're going to be covering the Atlanta Hawks, the Charlotte Hornets, the Miami Heat, the Orlando Magic, and the Washington Wizards. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss show announcements. Don't forget about our podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. It's also super helpful if you leave a rating and a review on that front. Jackson's doing great work on our social media feeds on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Make sure you guys follow us over there. And last but not least, if you want to get questions into our mailbags, we're going to have our first mailbag of this preseason phase next week. So drop your questions in the full episodes on YouTube in the comments, and we will get to them in our mailbags this next week as well as throughout the remainder of the season. All right, let's talk some basketball, starting with the Atlanta Hawks. Quite a bit of turnover on the back end of their roster. They lost Kobe Buffkin, Clint Capella out of the starting lineup, obviously, Karis LeVert, Terrence Mann, Garrison Matthews, Larry Nance Jr., and Georges Niang. They added Nickeil Alexander-Walker, one of my favorite 3-and-D guards in the league, Luke Kennard, one of the best catch-and-shoot players in the league, Kristaps Porzingis, a switch beater to help Trae Young, which we'll be talking about, Charles Bassey, Caleb Houston, a young wing who showed some shooting potential last year, and then their first-round pick, Asa Newell, athletic big who has made a name for himself as an offensive rebounder. He had 42 offensive rebound putbacks last year at Georgia, which tied for the second most in all of Division I basketball. I really like this Atlanta Hawks roster. It's built off of basketball principles that I believe strongly in. And I believe if they can stay healthy, that they will win a lot of basketball games based on this strong foundation. In a lot of ways, I'm going to have my eye on this team this year, almost as a proof of concept for what I believe in. If the way that I see the game going is accurate, so to speak, I think this Hawks team, as long as they stay healthy, is going to win a lot of games. I spoke in a video a few weeks ago about the idea that basketball flows down from advantage creation. If you have a guy who can break the defense down and create openings, just about any pro hooper will be able to find a way to thrive in those openings. For a lot of the offenses around the NBA, that the ones that struggle, it usually starts with creating that initial advantage and having a passer who's able to actually hit those openings when they take place. I think Trae Young is one of about a half dozen guys in the entire league that truly excels at this idea of advantage creation. On a team last year that was pretty devoid of offensive skill, and they had lost one of their best players early in the season in Jalen Johnson to injury, Trae Young posted, per Cleaning the Glass, who filters out garbage time, Trae Young posted a 117.4 offensive rating when he was on the floor last year. I think that's incredibly strong given the talent that he was playing with. And this roster compensates for Trae and his biggest weakness, which is his size and athleticism, by surrounding him with an incredible depth of high-level athletic talent. Guys who can defend, guys who can rebound, guys who run the floor super well, guys who play super hard every night. The four guys that I'm looking at here are Jalen Johnson, Zachary Rissache, Dyson Daniels, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. They bring defensive playmaking as well as end-to-end athleticism. I talked about last year, Zachary Rissache is one of the most gifted open floor athletes I've seen in terms of getting ahead of transition defense just with his end-to-end speed. Jalen Johnson is obviously every bit as formidable in that regard. So it starts with their transition attack, forcing misses, long misses in particular, and turnovers, and getting lots of easy stuff with their athleticism in the open court. And then Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Dyson Daniels represent one of the best duos of guard defenders, of perimeter defenders that you'll find in the league. They are going to start every defensive possession, again, as long as they can stay healthy, by making opposing ball handlers uncomfortable. That is the beginning of every great defensive possession in basketball, getting into the ball. That's what leads into forcing a team later into the clock, forcing them into tougher shots, which can lead to longer rebounds, forcing turnovers. And while all of those guys, all of those four guys have their offensive limitations, Nickeil Alexander-Walker has become a really nice catch and shoot player, as well as a guy who can put the ball on the floor. Jalen Johnson showed some offensive pop last year. These guys have offensive skills. I've talked about Zachary Rissache and his closeout attacking and his left-handed finishing. These guys all have things that they bring to the table. but all of them are not what you would consider to be like super high level offensive players, right? That's where Trae Young can support them in turn by creating high quality advantages, the kinds of advantages that pros like them will thrive under. And it'll make it easier for them on that end of the floor. I think this is going to be a team that thrives on the margins. And that's a big part of why I think they're going to win a lot of games. I think they're going to create margin in transition with their speed, get a lot of easy buckets before even having to confront half-court situations. I think they'll create margin by forcing turnovers. This team actually forced a lot of turnovers last year, and I think they'll force even more this year with the addition of Nickeil Alexander-Walker and just the growth individually of their young players. They're going to create margin on the offensive glass. Depending on how much Asa Newell plays, him and Onyeka Okongwu, they're a pretty devastating pair of offensive rebounders. That's a group of traits, those margins there, that just make it easier to win basketball games night to night in the NBA regular season. And then Ansi Salah did a really nice job of finding some complementary offensive talent to round out the margins for Trae Young on that end of the floor. So, for instance, Trae Young's biggest offensive weakness is beating switches. You can let him work against some form of drop coverage or high drop coverage or blitz or anything that's going to involve him having his defender chase over the top of the screen. Trae Young is going to pick you apart. But if you can switch, his inability to beat switches is something that has come up from time to time in his career. Kristaps Porzingis is the antidote to that. He can beat switches with quick post-ups and quick face-ups, something that he's been doing really well for years now, dating back to when he went to Washington, right? Luke Kennard is a super high-level shooting threat. He shot over 50% on unguarded catch-and-shoot jump shots last year. In fact, out of the 155 players in the league to take at least 200 catch-and-shoot jump shots last year, he was the third most efficient in the entire NBA. So you added one of the best shooters in the league, one of the best switch beaters in the league. That's going to go a long way towards rounding things out for them on offense. I feel very similarly about this Atlanta Hawks team to how I felt about the Clippers last summer. If you guys remember, I had very similar conversations about how even with Kawhi Leonard out, this was a Clippers team that had rim protection with Zubats and had a plethora of elite perimeter defenders and a floor-raising offensive engine in James Harden. And I talked about how I believed that would be enough to keep them afloat during the regular season. And that's a big part of why I'm optimistic about this particular Atlanta Hawks team. I don't feel them as a substantial threat to go win the title or anything, but they just check too many boxes for what I believe succeeds in the modern NBA to not win a lot of games. They have an elite advantage creator. They have complementary play finishing talent for different types of situations, guys who can run the floor in transition, guys who can beat switches in the post, guys who can be deadly from the perimeter. And they have a bunch of high motor athletes, just a bunch of big athletic dudes who play hard every single night. That is such a key to succeeding in the NBA regular season, where ebbs and flows and effort can play a massive role in whether or not games go one way or another. They have excellent perimeter defenders. Combined with rim protection with Kristaps Porzingis is healthy. I think that's a foundational strength for a defense. And they play in a pretty weak conference. So if they stay healthy, they get 60-plus games out of Kristaps Porzingis. You don't have an injury to a guy like Jalen Johnson. Trae Young can stay on the floor. If they get those things to go their way, I think they're a real threat to finish with a top 4 seed in that Eastern Conference and host a first-round series. Now, this could obviously go wrong in a bunch of different ways. But again, if they can stay healthy, I expect them to be one of the most fun teams in the NBA this year. I also view them as my personal favorite for a Giannis trade, should the opportunity arise. They can get a deal done with Jalen Johnson and Onyeka Okongwu and draft picks. And I think it's foolish to just say that Trae Young is the same as partnering Giannis with Dame. I view those two guards as remarkably different archetypes of players. I think Trae's in an entirely different class as a playmaker than Dame, especially with pick and roll partners. So I think they would thrive, him and Giannis, to a much greater extent than Dame ever could with Giannis. So just another Hawk storyline to keep an eye on this year. Today's show is brought to you by our new presenting sponsor, Hard Rock Bet. The NBA season is right around the corner, and we're incredibly excited. Haven't placed your first bet yet? Now is the perfect time. Bet $5, and if it wins, you don't just get your payout. You also cash in $150 in bonus bets on top. If you're looking to bet NBA futures, they're live on Hard Rock Bet. You can bet on the finals, MVP, Rookie of the Year, Sixth Man, and a lot more. Open up the app to see everything that's live and lock in today's odds if you like what you see. And on Wednesdays, if you're already betting on the Hard Rock Sportsbook app, you know what that means. It's the last day to use your legendary rewards drops. Open up the app today. You can have a bonus bet, or who knows what's in there. More drops every Thursday. The rewards and promos are nonstop. Download the Hard Rock Bet app today and make your first deposit. The Orlando Magic. They lost Cole Anthony, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Gary Harris, Caleb Houston, and Corey Joseph. They added Desmond Bane, their big offseason acquisition. Tyus Jones, one of the best catch-and-shoot players in the league, skill guard who was kind of wasted in Phoenix, who I think will be useful there. We'll talk about that in a second. Colin Castleton and Jace Richardson, as well as Noah Penda, their 2 draft picks. Jace is Jason Richardson's kid. He's just a really solid role player guard. And then Noah is a defensive forward prospect. All eyes will be on this refined offensive skill that they added this summer. Remember, this was the very worst jump shooting team in the NBA last year by a country mile. Tyus Jones is not the explosive athlete that Cole Anthony was, but he's a lot more polished. Now, Tyus's polish was wasted on a Phoenix Suns team that needed athleticism and physicality from the guard position, not necessarily skill. But it will be welcomed in Orlando. For starters, he brings reliable shooting to a team that can't shoot. He was 87 for 172 on unguarded catch-and-shoot threes last year, Tyus Jones. That's 51%. He's going to hit open shots. And he has the ability to make some pick-and-roll shots in two-man game. He can hit floaters in the mid-40s. He can hit mid-range jump shots in the mid-40s. So I think he has the ability to run some action with Orlando's screeners as well. I just think he'll be a lot more valuable here than he was in Phoenix. And you don't have to worry about his physical limitations as much because, yes, he's a poor defender in just about every facet, but he'll be surrounded by elite defensive talent, and you won't have to depend on him in big spots because he's not in your best 5-man groupings. Just a really solid rotation player that fits a very specific need for this group. Desmond Bane, though, is the real dynamic piece that Orlando brought in, and I could not be more excited about the natural basketball fit. I talk about this idea all the time. Your value to your basketball team has to do with the role you're in and what they need from you, not what you're good at in a vacuum. Desmond Bane may not be the superstar talent that some other guys around the league are, but his specific skill set is going to be ultra valuable in this Orlando Magic system. I actually want to start on the defensive end of the floor here. Anytime you go and grab a skill guard, you worry about dealing with an inferior athlete, right? A guy who's going to give up a bunch of his production on the other end of the floor, getting attacked or making mistakes, right? That is not the case with Desmond Bane. He's a competitive MFer who plays his ass off on defense. He's got a trunky frame that makes him difficult to exploit with size mismatches. He flies around, applies great ball pressure. He's going to get favorable matchups because of the partnership with Jalen Suggs, so he's not going to have to guard the other team's best player or anything like that. I think he's going to contribute to Orlando's defensive identity, not take away from it. And on offense, he represents the first player in the Franz and Paolo era that can actually unlock those two guys in their two-man game situations, whether that be ghost screens or even just using them as role men and in two-man game situations like ball screens and things along those lines. Any action Orlando would run with their guards before Desmond Bane entered the equation, even decent shooters, guys like Jalen Suggs or Corey Joseph, teams would just be willing to live with the results. You'd live with them taking threes, slipping out of a ghost screen. You'd live with them taking pull-up threes out of a ball screen if you got a good screen on the on-ball defender. They would make it hard for guys like Paolo and Franz to actually make the defense pay for lingering or sticking two on the ball. It also made it harder for them to get favorable switches because you could get away with hedging and recovering against those level of shooters. You are not going to be able to just live with Desmond Bane getting good looks. He shot over 50% on unguarded catch and shoot threes last year. More than half. You cannot leave him open. So by the way, Orlando, the worst three-point shooting team in the NBA last year, added 2 50+% open three-point shooters. That's going to be a big boost for them in a key area. Bane was also one of the best pull-up shooters in the league last year. Out of 60 players in the league to attempt at least 250 pull-up jump shots last year, he was 15th, so in that upper fourth, ahead of guys like Damian Lillard, Devin Booker, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, or Jalen Brunson. That will force defenses into more compromising positions. If you give up open shots to elite shooters, they're going to make them. If you have Desmond Bane set a screen and you stay attached to Desmond Bane on a screen for Franz or a screen for Paolo, those dudes are going to go screaming downhill because the bigger defenders guarding Paolo and Franz are not going to be good at navigating screens. If you switch, now you're giving Paolo and Franz favorable size advantages, something they had struggled at times to achieve against the hedge and covers that they often face in years past. In situations where Paolo and Franz are the screener, they should get more opportunities on the roll because you'll actually have to account for Desmond Bane in that situation instead of just living with the guy taking a shot coming off of that screen. Those two guys combined for about 110 roll man possessions last year. I think we could see that number double this year, potentially. And lastly, for clutch situations, the Magic now finally have two-man game combinations that they can actually go to and count on getting quality stuff. Advantages either for guys slipping out or for mismatch attacking situations with Smalls getting onto Franz and Paolo. This was the 6th worst clutch offense in the league last year. They lost 17 games in clutch situations. In the series against Boston, when they got killed in crunch time, they managed just a 90 offensive rating in the 2 games in that series that went into the clutch. I expect Desmond Bane to really grease the wheels for them in these spots. The rest of the story for the Magic this season will come down to the continued skill development of Paolo and Franz. Paolo showed some real growth as a short-range shot maker last year. He was 50% on jump shots inside of 17 feet. He was 48% on floaters. But his jumper fell apart when he got further away from the basket, and those short-range percentages both dipped down into something less favorable when they got into the playoffs. Including against Boston, Paolo was below 50% at the rim. So improved skill development for Paolo over the course of this year will be key. And then Franz, I've been waiting for Franz to improve as a jump shooter for years. He was 30% on jump shots last year with the Magic, 28% with Germany this summer. He has shown, similarly to Paolo, some impressive short-range shot making. He's got a good floater, and he can hit the jumpers inside of 17 feet. But those two guys just improving overall as perimeter players will be another key swing factor for Orlando this year. I think this Orlando team is going to be really good. I think with Desmond Bane, they have a legitimate chance to win the conference. Bane, to me, is the classic example of your value is more specific to your situation than in a vacuum. And I think Bane plugs naturally into a very specific need for this team. And now you have Paolo and Franz with a couple years of playoff experience. The Celtics and Pacers are out of the mix. So it kind of feels like that first real opportunity for a long playoff run for the Magic. We saw how their physicality caused concerns for Cleveland 2 years ago. This is going to be a fun season for Magic fans. They have every reason to be very optimistic. All right, we're going to go very quickly over the course of these last 3, or I should say quicker over these last 3. Miami Heat. They lost Kyle Anderson, Alec Burks, Haywood Highsmith, Kevin Love, and Duncan Robinson. They added Precious Achiuwa, Simone Fontecchio, Norman Powell as their Duncan Robinson replacement. I like Norman. I think he can obviously have health issues from time to time, but when he's healthy and on the floor every night and in rhythm, he had some really high-level scoring stretches last year for the Clippers. And then their first-round pick, Kasparas Yakuchonis, basically the classic big European shot creator from the perimeter type of vibe. You guys have seen a bunch of that sort of dude come through the league in recent years. This feels like one of those years where Miami could be sneaky dangerous. There aren't any truly great teams in the Eastern Conference aside from Cleveland, and that just depends on how you feel about them. I definitely think that they would qualify as a team that kind of has separated themselves from the rest of the teams in the East. But whether or not they can really contend with the Denver, Oklahoma City types, I think that's reasonable to debate or to have some doubts about. I personally have some doubts there, but there are no what I would consider to be top tier championship contenders in the conference. And I've often referred to Miami over the years as the bouncer to the championship club, a team that is so well coached and solid in every phase of basketball that they can expose teams that aren't real contenders. They'll lose to the eventual real contender. They'll lose to that 2022 Boston team, when that particular team, when they were so locked in on defense, was just at another level that Miami couldn't reach. They lost to Denver, right? They're going to they're going to run into certain teams that are just too much for them. But anybody that's beneath that true championship contender tier, Miami's exposed in recent years. So I think it'd be foolish for us to just think it's impossible that we'd be watching this Heat team potentially playing the conference finals this year. The difference is Jimmy Butler's gone. And maybe that ends up being the difference between those Miami Heat teams and this one. But I guess we'll see. Time will tell, right? I like the changes to the roster over the last year. I'm actually an Andrew Wiggins fan. I think he's one of the best perimeter defenders in the league still. And I think his athleticism is still game changing. Having guys like him and Davion Mitchell as primary perimeter defense options with Bam Adebayo on the back line and Kelly Ware theoretically with the player that he can become as a rim protector, like that's a strong foundation defensively. I think Norman Powell is going to be a great fit and bring that much needed offensive firepower. Tyler Herro's coming off of a leap. He went for 24, 5, and 6 on 61% true shooting last year. The Bam Adebayo, Kelly Ware, like too big look was honestly, it had a very promising first campaign. They were plus 4 points per 100 possessions in 1,088 possessions. That's a pretty large sample size of those two being successful. I think they're going to be top 10 defense again. And I think they have a chance with the improvement internally and with the addition of Norman Powell to kind of get into that middle of the pack on offense, somewhere in that like 15 to 17 range. And if they get there, they're going to win like somewhere between 40 and 45 games. And then because of their coaching, because of just that, whatever it is, that Miami Heat culture, or maybe it's just Spoelstra, whatever it is, they're just always a threat to steal a playoff series or two. I think they're a super long shot to win the conference, but I think this will be a fun Miami Heat team. And then the big potential curveball here is whether or not they decide to make some trades. Wiggins is a guy who has some interest around the league. I know the Lakers want him. They kind of make complementary trade partners because the Heat are light at power forward and the Lakers are light at small forward, and they have the ability to kind of piece that together. But I think the Heat want a first-round pick, and I know the Lakers don't want to use a first-round pick. So I think both of those positions are completely reasonable. I can totally see why Miami would not want to give up a player that is such a strong foundational perimeter defender and an athlete in Andrew Wiggins without getting first-round draft compensation. And I can totally see why the Lakers are like, we don't want to give up a first-round pick with a 27-year-old Luka and a 40-year-old LeBron to get a 30-year-old player who's theoretically at the tail end of his athletic prime. So like, I think both positions there are completely reasonable. And so I can totally see why a deal hasn't gotten done. And it may never go anywhere at that point, unless one of those teams becomes desperate. And we'll just see if that ends up happening. I doubt it at this point. I want Wiggins, but I'm reasonable enough to know that it's a long shot. And then the Heat have some big picture questions surrounding whether or not they're committed to the Bam Adebayo, Tyler Herro core. Like, I know teams like Dallas or Houston would potentially be interested in a guy like Tyler Herro. And that draft compensation that they received there could spark the next era of Miami Heat basketball. So that's really the final piece of this Heat story this year. Are they happy with being just the feisty Eastern Conference team that could win a series or two? Or do they want to pivot towards a full rebuild? And that's going to be the other big storyline to watch with the Heat this year. Next, the Washington Wizards. They lost Sadiq Bey, Malcolm Brogdon, Rashawn Holmes, and Jordan Poole. Added Marvin Bagley, Malachi Branham, CJ McCollum, Cam Whitmore, a nice flyer on an athletic wing out of Houston with some upsides. And then my favorite player in this year's draft lottery, Trae Johnson, a very skilled guard with some good size and athleticism that can shoot off the move and shoot off the dribble, and a lot of like stuff that works in the modern NBA in terms of scoring. They also have another first rounder, Will Riley, who's a big wing who also has some potential as a tough shot maker. This is easily one of the most interesting young teams in the NBA that are in that rebuilding phase, right? Because they just have a boatload of super interesting young players. They have an exciting young backcourt fueled by guys that I think will be complementary with Bub Carrington and Trae Johnson. Again, Trae Johnson's ability to score off the ball in off-ball action, I think, makes him a natural fit there. A bunch of athletic wings, guys like Bilal Coulibaly and Cam Whitmore. Lots of shooting with the young draft picks, as well as Corey Kispert. We'll see how much guys like CJ McCollum and Chris Middleton play, but they obviously bring shooting as well. I just think in general, those are two awesome vets to have in that locker room to help with the development of your young guards. I talked about this after the draft, but like, I think Trae Johnson in particular, I was watching him in the footage and he's kind of still doing everything at 100 miles an hour, which is typical for a young player who likes to score off screens because perpetual motion brings a bunch of advantages there. But there's a change of pace element that I think he could improve on. And like CJ McCollum is like the perfect guy as a guy who had some athletic limitations to go to Trae and be like, here's 3 or 4 things you can do in terms of nuances of navigating screens as an offensive player to help get yourself more openings. I think CJ is going to be a good mentor for him there. And then I think they're destined to be a good defense. Alex Sarr showed plenty of upside last year to think that he could become a strong defensive foundation. They have an elite defensive wing prospect in Bilal Coulibaly to complement that, and plenty of athleticism down the roster. And so this is the fun year for Wizards fans because you know you're headed in the right direction, and this is the season that will be a good start to finish showcase of their young offensive talent. And we should get a much better feel for their overall trajectory after this year, which will then be informative for what the next phase of Wizards basketball looks like in terms of how they can rebuild around those guys. Lastly for today, the Charlotte Hornets. They lost Seth Curry, Taj Gibson, Yusuf Nurkic, Josh Okogie, Mark Williams, and a few other young players. They added Pat Connaughton, Spencer Dinwiddie, Mason Plumlee, Colin Sexton, and a bunch of draft picks. Concanipple and Liam McNeely in the first round, a couple of big and skilled wings. Sion James and Ryan Kalkbrenner in the early second round. Sion's like a fire hydrant, like Lou Dort build type of wing. And then Ryan Kalkbrenner is a big for a team that has probably the weakest center rotation in the league right now. Right, them or Boston. They're in that group, right? This is an incredibly strange team. On the one hand, I like several of their young players. Like Brandon Miller had an 11-game stretch last year before his injury where he averaged an efficient 28 points per game. I think he's blossoming nicely into one of those like future star wings that we're going to have in this league. I think Concanipple is going to be a good NBA player. He's big, he's smart, he can shoot the ball, and he knows how to like make the right reads. He knows how to make the right reads when he's coming off of screening actions. There's a lot of value in players like that in the modern NBA. Trae Mann has been one of my favorite backup guards in the league for a while. Just an incredibly aesthetically appealing game. But I have big questions in other areas. I have incredibly complex feelings about LaMelo Ball. On the one hand, I'm still a big believer in his talent on offense. I know he can be a bit of an inefficient shot chucker, but I consider him to be like a real advantage creator. Like a one of those offensive engine types that I talk so much about. And that's just a super rare trait in this league. That Hornets team was hopeless to score the basketball when he was off the floor last year. And when LaMelo was on, they were a decent offense. And I don't think that is a accomplishment to take lightly by any means. But on the other hand, he's got this like general air of unseriousness that bothers me in terms of his role as the leader of the team. And he's missed 44% of his games as a pro. He's played in 231 games out of 410 potential games. That means he's missed 179 games. He's failed to play in 50 games in 3 consecutive seasons. So as much as I believe in his foundational talent, I'm basically out on him as a foundational superstar at this point, a guy you need to build your franchise around. Even though I believe in that skill, he can't stay on the floor, and it's just delaying whatever sort of progress he can make in terms of just figuring out how to be a pro. I just don't see it as a foundational superstar in this league. And they've loaded up on all this veteran ball handling for some reason, which I thought was strange. Like, you still have Trae Mann and Brandon Miller. And if LaMelo's healthy, obviously he's going to handle the ball a ton. So, like, I don't understand why you'd bring in Spencer Dinwiddie and Colin Sexton. I could see one of those guys as like LaMelo insurance, but I just thought that was strange. And obviously this team has one of the worst center rotations in the league. So I think they're a safe bet to compete with Brooklyn as the worst team in the Eastern Conference this year. And for you Hornets fans, just enjoy watching Brandon Miller and Concanipple and those other draft picks, and just hope one of those guys pop enough to give you some advantage or some optimism for the future. All right, guys, that's all I have for today. As always, I sincerely appreciate you guys for supporting me and supporting the show. We will be back next week as we dig into the rest of our preseason content. We're going to be covering our top contenders. We're going to be talking about awards. We're going to have a mailbag. We'll also have some more preseason reaction. I will see you guys then.